So 7 suspects charged today with a gang rape in Krugersdorp last month, and the NPA is telling us 7 more will be charged tomorrow. There may also be further arrests. We know the police have been conducting ID parades and prioritising DNA results since the crime occurred. But what is required to deliver a successful verdict in a country where not only do so many rapes go unreported, but victims often feel violated again by a system that doesn't yet offer enough care and support? I'm joined now by Vetten, researcher and gender activist at the University of Johannesburg. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. So we know that in this particular case in Krugersdorp, the police are prioritising quick results from the DNA testing. Is a conviction possible without that testing?
It would be incredibly difficult. I mean, reports have suggested that most of the men, if not all of the men, were wearing balaclavas. It was a scene of incredible confusion. There were very many men milling around. There was a great deal of noise and I think a great deal of trauma at that point in time. So it might be quite possible to shake eyewitness identification under cross-examination. DNA is a lot more definitive as long as all steps have been followed, and there can be no question raised as to whether samples got muddled up or anything like that.
Yeah, and I mean, that speaks to the process and a watertight case being built and every procedure followed meticulously. How difficult is it to secure convictions in a gang rape case as opposed to just a one rape case? Is it quite difficult, or is it pretty much the same?
Gang rape can be difficult, but that's usually because there are so few cases that result in arrests. And where you don't have DNA, you know, it can be, you sit with a situation where somebody says, oh, but I didn't rape. I don't dispute that she was raped, but it wasn't me. And if you don't have the DNA to counter that, then you sit with an incredibly difficult situation, especially when the circumstances were like this and there was so much confusion and there were balaclavas being worn. Because I think usually in a stranger rape, unlike or gang rapes, unlike those where people are known to each other, there can be no question of consent. So everything hinges on a good, strong case of identification.
So the NPA has been reporting they're making some headway in clearing this massive DNA backlog that they've been battling for some time. But my understanding is, and you'll know better than me, that they've still got quite a way to go. Is it fair to say, Lisa, that convictions for rape are essentially on hold until that backlog is cleared?
Well, yes and no, because I think the situation, what has happened in reality is that if you have a suspect in custody and you're waiting for DNA and it's a year, 18 months, 2 years later, the suspect's attorney is going to say justice delayed is justice denied. And if you don't start with a trial, I'm going to ask for it to be struck off the roll. So if that happens, it means the case is completely taken out of the courts and you've got to start the process all over again. So what that means in practice is that many prosecutors are taking, rather than have that happen, prosecutors are going ahead in order to try and keep the case alive and going ahead and trying to prosecute and taking their chances. So it's a far from ideal situation. You know, it's also a situation where many of your complainants become very disheartened. They go to court, it's postponed. They go to court, it's postponed. They go to court, it's postponed. There's a point where they feel they just want to disengage with the criminal justice system and get on with their lives. So the backlog at the laboratories is far from ideal, and it is a denial of justice.
How is the backlog, the project to deal with the backlog, progressing, and how much progress is it making?
That's hard to say, because some of the figures that the police give you as the size of the backlog don't really square with the number of rapes. I'm not too sure what they're counting, whether it's DNA from semen only, or whether it's DNA from hair or other samples. So it's very hard to always figure out. I personally find it very hard to figure out what it is that they're talking about when they're talking about that backlog. Sometimes it can be the DNA backlog, I think the backlog for toxicology. So, for instance, where there's a suspicion that your drink might have been spiked, for instance, that backlog is even greater, it would appear at this point in time, than the actual DNA analysis. So there's a lot of work that needs to still be done at the laboratories, I think, in order to try and get them to function properly. And I think what is very concerning is that cases of DNA backlogs date back to the early 2000s. So it's not a new problem. So it tells us there's something very entrenched there that they've not sorted out over more than a decade now.
You know, Lisa, tragically, we know that many women are raped every single day in our country. Do you think it is important that this particular gang rape case, that the DNA samples are being prioritised and fast-tracked? Do you think it's the right thing to do? Or do you think it's unfair to the many other women who have been raped?
Look, all rape complainants should have their samples fast-tracked and dealt with in the best possible way. There can be no argument around that. I think this one, you could be concerned about the speed and ask questions like, is this only happening because it's a high-profile case? And does this tell us that the police only make an effort when there is public attention focused on them? And the second question you can ask is this case also being fast-tracked because the men accused are so-called foreign nationals? And we have an element of xenophobia happening here. So, I mean, there are aspects to this case that do raise questions, but I think it is important, and it is important that we get to a position where all complainants' cases samples are analysed as quickly as possible.
Talk to me about the court process and what needs to be done in terms of preserving the chain of evidence, following procedure to get a conviction. I mean, you've mentioned the problem with the DNA backlog, which is a massive issue. But what else needs to be done carefully in gathering evidence to ensure a successful conviction?
Well, you talked about chain of evidence, so it's going to be very, very important, because so much of this case is going to hinge around the DNA identification, that there can be no arguments of, oh, we got the samples confused, this sample might belong to somebody else, because you remember they arrested 80 men. So potentially they've sorted through 80 different samples. So they're going to have to show that at no point could any confusion have occurred over whose samples are whose. That's going to be point number one. Point number two is obviously going to be around preparing your complainants. As I said, this is not going to be a matter that's going to be focused on consent. So cross-examination tends to be a little less brutal when it's a stranger rape than in comparison to where it's an issue of consent. But nonetheless, there'll need to be careful preparation for the complainants, helping them to understand the kinds of questions that they should expect. Helping them to get to a point where they feel it's difficult and it is anxiety provoking, but given that they're still able to go ahead and to feel ready for it. I think when you have a situation where you have somebody who is still very, very deeply traumatized, it actually traumatizes them further to put them into the witness box to talk when they're not ready. So there's also going to be a need to assess how ready they each are, because remember, you're dealing with 8 different complainants. And so there might need to be accommodation of complainants who maybe struggling towards a greater degree than others, so spending more time in getting them ready. I think also making sure that those sorts of steps need to be put in place.
So, Lisa, we're in Women's Month and there's always an extra focus, though, of course, we know it's a pandemic of gender-based violence in this country. We know that in, I think it was 2019, the President released this National Strategic Plan to deal with GBV. We know that every police station is supposed to have a special room for women or anyone who's been violated. Generally, though, Lisa, you look at this all the time. You look at the nuts and bolts. Are things getting better or worse in terms of how we look after people once they've reported rape?
I think it's getting worse, to be honest. And I think why I say that is, I'm not sure if you're aware that the information regulator is investigating the fact that it would appear that the police may have leaked the names and addresses of all 18 of those people who were victimized in West Village in Krugersdorp. That is deeply, deeply concerning. They have reported that they've had reports of this list of details circulating on WhatsApp. That is utterly unforgivable, and I think one wants to hear what the police are going to say, and if that's going to be explained, because that's just such a massive violation of somebody's safety for people to know their names and their physical addresses. So, to make a mistake like that in a high-profile case like this is very concerning. I think we've also got to take into account what has happened to the funding of social services, social care, the NGOs who are working in Tutuzela care centres to try and provide services. That funding has not increased. So we've seen in some instances that organisations have had to pull out of providing post-rape care. We're also not seeing funding access being given to psychological assistance. So I think if you're on medical aid, that helps you. But if you're not on medical aid, there isn't a serve there to get you to a psychologist. You're going to wait 3 to 4 months before a psychologist sees you at the hospital if you haven't given up by then. So I think if you look at the rape statistics over the last decade, you can see a decline from 47,000 being reported in about 2011-12 to about 42,000 having been reported last year. So you can see a decline. But treatment of victims is not necessarily improving. And I think what is even more concerning, once you look at the NPA's annual reports, you will see that the number of rapes being put down for prosecution is actually lower than it was 8 years ago. So we're seeing a decline in court performance, in addition to, I think, the decline in the quality and a number of services being made available to those who've been raped.
A grim reality, an important one to hear about. Thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. That's Vetten, researcher and gender activist at the University of Johannesburg.